Hi, today we're going to be talking about New Historicism, the literary critique, in relation to the book The House of Impossible Beauties by Joseph Cassara, particularly pertaining to the last scene in the book in the section Coda Going. So in order to begin, we'll have to establish what New Historicism is. New Historicism is a form of literary criticism in which we must understand the ideology and culture of a different time of history to interpret a text as a historic artifact. As a New Historicism critic, we have to understand that it's unavoidable that our own biases from our own ideologies that we exist in may come into play, and we must try to see history as it was by understanding the socioeconomic status, the political policies, the culture in which people were living at the time. And once we can fully, to our best knowledge, understand the time in which they're living, we can use that information in order to observe the text as historic artifacts. New historicists don't see a single piece of literature as an artifact representing one person. They see it more as a product of the ideology in which the person has lived in. Therefore, it's really the product of the culture itself. So the literature does not just pertain to the person who's writing it, but also to what was going on around them at the time. Additionally, new historicists tend to ask, how has this event been interpreted by others, and what do their interpretations tell us about those who have interpreted this previously? That idea that a part of new historicism is observing how others have previously interpreted literary artifacts, we have to do that when observing The House of Impossible Beauties, because the original artifact that it was based off of was the documentary Paris is Burning. In fact, in an interview with The Millions, Joseph Cassara says that the documentary Paris is Burning, he constantly watched it. He said, "My goal was to study these moments in the film as closely as possible so that I could render something similar on the page with precision." What we're seeing in the book, The House of Impossible Beauties, is exactly what we've already said it is. We know that it's a modern day interpretation of what's happened in the 1980s and what happened in the documentary Paris is Burning. So as new historians, we ask, how has this work been interpreted, and what does it say about the people who have interpreted it? And I would say that Joseph Cassara interpreted Paris is Burning with the understanding that queer communities were underrepresented and erased over time. Perhaps as a gay Latino man from New York, Cassara has experienced some of that erasure in his own life by not being able to see himself in history the way that a white straight person would be able to. Additionally, in an interview with Electric Literature, Cassara said, quote, "I feel like my goal as a writer is to resurrect stories from the past and revisit them in the present. I'm interested in stories that are at risk of being lost because they haven't been preserved or they have been erased." Unquote. So what happened during the HIV/AIDS epidemic that Cassara felt like he had to memorialize the victims who suffered at that time, primarily during the 80s? One quote that I read while reading Clinical Care in the AIDS Epidemic by Dr. Gerald H. Freeland. This was actually published in 1989 during the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Freeland, in his experience treating HIV, said, quote, "At the beginning, I could individualize each AIDS patient's care, but as the numbers have increased, knowing each patient with AIDS personally has become impossible." So, despite the erasure that has happened at the time, it was such a rapidly spreading disease that healthcare providers they weren't equipped to take care of. Another reason for that erasure or lack of even acknowledgement at the time that we can read about in the AIDS Epidemic Neglected Issues by Bruce F. Farber and Mark H. Haplin, published in 1987, they said, quote, "In some instances, internists who previously specialized in caring for gay men have become primary care physicians to patients with AIDS. Fear of transmission, particularly among many other subspecialists and surgeons who do not regularly deal with these patients, has often put the primary care clinician in new, awkward positions. Usually such fear manifests itself in subtle ways. For example, non-essential procedures are postponed in the hopes that they can be permanently avoided." So even in this particular example, which was published in 1987, we can see that there was a link between refusal to treat patients and their sexuality. Aside from what healthcare providers were saying about their opinions and experiences during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, Eric Jimenez Lindmeyer wrote an article in the Huffington Post about his experience growing up as an adolescent in the 1980s during this time. So not only should we be looking at the experience of the HIV/AIDS patients, but also the culture that was happening in regards to homosexuals at the time. He stated, quote, "Being gay in the 80s meant being isolated from an identity. There was no discussion of homosexuality in school, not even in our year-long health and sexuality class, even though we were in the middle of the AIDS crisis," unquote. So while reading The House of Impossible Beauties, we have to keep in mind that during this time in the 1980s, the culture that they were existing in, the ideology that they were existing in, we're all pointing to the fact that gay people don't matter to society. I think that the final scene in the book is the most important in the book because it offers us insight to not just what people were experiencing during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, but what the aftermath of it was and what people had to deal with even after the storm and the sadness and the loss that they experienced. So the last scene starts out, and they had just gotten home prior to the scene. They had just gotten home from the subway ride that they had taken together, and Daniel was cleaning Angel's clothes, which she had soiled because of complications due to HIV/AIDS. During this scene, Daniel was thinking to himself, and he said, "There must be something someone could do. Surely there must be a way to take a stain out of fabric." I feel like this has two sort of meanings behind it. Not only is he thinking to himself, Angel's life is coming to an end, there has to be some sort of way to take this disease out of her body, but I think that it's also referring back to previously in the book with the couch when he was with Juanito and he stained the couch and Juanito was trying so desperately to get the stain out of the couch. I think that the stain in the book is a reoccurring image of something that they want undone that they can't get undone. Additionally, because we're looking at this with a critique of New Historicism, we need to remember that there wasn't anything to be done about AIDS at the time, just like there's nothing to be done about a stain in a couch or a stain in a dress. There's nothing that could be done at the time about AIDS. There wasn't treatment the way that there is today. From the example of Daniel taking care of Angel while she was suffering of HIV/AIDS, we can see Joseph Cassara's commentary on the containment which happened at the time that people of lower socioeconomic statuses experienced when they were beginning to die of HIV/AIDS. Containment is a new historist word which focuses on how the hegemon consolidates the status quo. So in this case, we're looking at a group of people who are of a lower socioeconomic status, who are people of color, who are also queer, and they aren't receiving any medical treatment. However, there were people at the time who were receiving medical treatment who didn't fall under those categories. This was a way of the hegemon maintaining its power at the time, and Joseph Cassara portrayed it by leaving Daniel as the sole care provider for Angel at the time, and inevitably having to take over the House of Extravaganza. Later on in the scene, the narrator says he had a flash of what his life would be like by now, when Angel was gone, walking the streets and bringing the Ninas and Banjis and the fierce fire sparkler kings and queens into their house. He didn't want this responsibility, but he had inherited it. So why is it important that we understand the consequences of Angel dying in Daniel's life and we get that foreshadowing of what he's going to experience because of losing the ones close to him? Well, as new historists, we understand that we can learn a lot more from the lives of the masses as opposed to listening to the people in power at the time, because by understanding the lives of the masses, we are understanding the product of the ideology and the culture which these characters are living in. So to further understand the experiences of the masses, we find out later in the scene that in just a month, Angel would die at St. Vincent's. In 5 months, Dorian would also die. Both would die to complications due to HIV/AIDS. So by understanding Daniel's experience of losing everyone close to him in his life, aside from Pepper LeBeha, who would also mourn with him, we further understand the experiences of the masses at the time, which gives us the depiction of the product of the ideologies. We can see in this last scene at the end of the book that these communities, these houses in New York, were ostracized parts of the New York community because there wasn't anyone taking care of them other than themselves and other than their own people. And now we can see the circulation of power that has happened because this book was written just the last couple of years in order to memorialize these people. At the end of the book, we come to find out that Daniel has taken the role as the house father and that he has taken over the responsibilities of the House of Extravaganza, which could also be seen as an idea of circulation of power, because Daniel came in and was one of the youngest members of the house, and they were apprehensive to letting him in the house at first, as they are with every member. And towards the end of Angel's life, he ended up being the one who took over once she passed. The House of Impossible Beauties is a new historist text because Joseph Cassara is writing in modern day times about something which has happened in the past and already occurred, and he took his ideas off of other works of literature, which he used as historic artifacts in order to document these events. It's almost an inception to be studying the House of Impossible Beauties with a new historist lens, because he was essentially writing it as a new historist. Although in these last scenes, it does end in a sad way with Daniel being left by himself without Angel to manage and expand the House of Extravaganza, I think it gives the reader an insightful look on what life was like at the time. People were losing everyone that they had because of this illness. And however, there was still hope, and there were still people who were going to keep pushing forward and walking so that others could run, much like Angel did throughout the whole book.